Hi, the poem for today is Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Unlike the previous two love poems we've looked at, this is much older. This is from the middle 1800s. This series of poems, 44 of them altogether, 44 sonnets, were published in 1850. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote 44 sonnets for her husband, Robert Browning. If you already know this poem, pause the video now and without your notes answer these three questions. How is anaphora or repetition used in this poem? Which semantic field is important in the poem? And how is structure used for effect? Then restart the video, watch it and check your answers. My tips. Firstly, pause the video regularly and take notes. Use the layout on the next slide to structure your notes. You might find it useful to use the images. They might just jog your memory. And remember to test yourself regularly, like the three questions at the start of this video did. It's the best way to revise, to put yourself under a little bit of pressure and try and recall things by testing yourself. Here's the structure for your notes. There is a lot more in the poem than can actually be fitted into this structure. However, this will give you more than enough to write about the poems in the exam. Obviously, if you want to go into a little bit more depth, that's perfectly okay. But remember, you've got 20 minutes to write about the first poem and 40 minutes to compare two poems in part B of the poetry question. So there's a limit to what you can actually say. Okay, the context of this. Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a series of 44 sonnets to her husband, Robert Browning. They were called Sonnets in the Portuguese, and they all follow this theme of her love for him. Sonnets are a traditional choice for English love poetry. Ever since Shakespeare wrote a series of sonnets, it's been seen as the way to write love poetry for someone that you really care about. A sonnet sequence, as we call it, is a powerful declaration of love. Elizabeth Barrett Browning led a rather unusual life. She was incredibly religious, but was relatively lonely until she met Robert Browning. And on meeting him and falling in love, he became her whole world. Unfortunately for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, her father disowned her and really ostracised her, so that her husband became the overriding dominant force in her life. Okay, let's have a look at the poem. When we see this square layout on a page, it's worth always counting the lines, especially if you get an unseen poem. Sonnets have 14 lines, but they have this kind of square sort of structure. So it's really worth you making sure, if you've got an unseen poem, that it's got 14 lines, or checking if it's got 14 lines. And then you should be thinking, is this a sonnet? In which case, is it about love? So the first language point that I would make is that we can see that Elizabeth Barrett Browning repeats the phrase, I love thee, 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 throughout the poem. It's clearly the most important message of the poem. But you can notice that this repetition is at the start of lines, and it even here at the start of a phrase, look. And we know that this sort of repetition is a special name. It's called anaphora. Okay, and anaphora is repetition at the start of a line, and it emphasizes the importance of the message. So the repetition of I love thee makes it clear this is the most significant message in the poem. When repetition occurs at the start of a line or phrase, we call it anaphora. Here it emphasizes the importance of the message. So regardless of whatever else is in this poem, Elizabeth Barrett Browning wants Robert Browning to know that she loves him, and that overrides all other messages. Okay, the second language point I would have you make is slightly more complex. Now we can see at first the speaker seems to be trying to define or measure her love. She says, How do I love thee? She asks a question, and then she says, let me count the ways, and she's going to measure the depth and breadth and height of her love. She's going to try and define her love. However, in the green, you can see that she's going to use her soul as a way of measuring her love. Well, a soul is an abstract noun. You can't see a soul, you can't measure a soul. And what she's actually saying is that the size of her love, the extent of her love, is infinite. She can't measure it. It's so big it cannot be measured. It's something which is immeasurable. So because she uses the abstract noun soul, we can see that what she's actually saying is that her love is infinite. So there's your second language point. She's trying to define love, but she uses abstract nouns, showing that her love is actually infinite. And I've given you a little measuring tape to jog your memory of that. Okay, the third language point is very straightforward. We can see the words soul, grace, candlelight, praise, faith, saints, God. We could also look for pure in here, and we can see that this is a lot of religious language. The religious language in this poem suggests that her love for Robert Browning is all-consuming. It completely dominates her whole life, really, like her love for God. It affects every aspect of her life and is unconditional. It doesn't need anything back, like faith. The whole point of faith is that it's something you have without requiring any proof. And here, Elizabeth Barrett Browning is comparing her love to religious faith. She doesn't need anything back from Robert Browning. It's simply enough that she loves him like she loves God. So there's your third language point, the use of religious language, suggesting that her love is unconditional and all-consuming. And I've given you some little picture of candlelight and the religious connotations of that to jog your memory for that one. Okay, we move on to structure, and as we've already mentioned, this is a sonnet. It's called Sonnet 43, and the poem is a traditional form of English love poetry. If you wanted to write a poem to tell someone that you love them, the traditional form would be a sonnet. The fact that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote 44 of them, Sonnet 43 being the most well known, demonstrates the intensity of her love and how big her commitment to this is. I mean, it's quite an effort to write 44 poems, all beautifully written sonnets. So the first structural point we can make is really about the form of the poem. It is a sonnet, which is a very traditional form of love poetry. The second language point I would make is about the final line. I shall but love thee better after death, says Barrett Browning in this poem. Ending with the word death, suggesting the eternity of that the poem doesn't really end. It's going to go, the feelings in this poem are going to go on after death. And being the final words in the poem suggests this eternity. The final lines show not only her belief in a God and an afterlife, but also expresses a very traditional view of true love as something which lasts forever. One true love. It's very, very traditional. Now we might see it as a little bit cliche. So there's your second structural point. The final line suggests that her love for him is so great it will go beyond the grave. And I've given you this idea of the eternity symbol with love there as well to suggest this idea that she's putting forward. And Barrett Browning shows us that you can't really define love. She can't measure it. She compares it to a soul. And in this aspect, she is similar to Carol Ann Duffy writing Valentine, where Duffy can tell us what love isn't, but is less clear about what love is. Both Barrett Browning and Duffy struggle to define love. However, Barrett Browning portrays a very traditional and idealistic view of love as some sort of perfection, a relationship that will last for all eternity, whereas we know Carol Ann Duffy in Valentine portrays a much more realistic view of love. And again, Barrett Browning believes love is like a religious experience. The only religious connotations in Duffy's poem are the idea of marriage, a wedding ring, and even that is seen as an option. So the poems are not the same, however, they do share this one aspect that both struggle to define what love is. For a reader in 1850, this poem would be seen as a beautiful love poem, and in many anthologies of love poetry, this is one of the nation's favourite poems, showing that love is eternal and dominating. In 2020, many people would still see it in a similar way, but to other modern readers, the poem can seem a little bit over the top, a little bit cliche. The hyperbole in here, "I'll love you forever," doesn't sit well with our more modern views and modern ideas of relationships. I hope this has given you enough to write about this poem, and I'll see you for the next poem.